Okay, so welcome everybody. Welcome to the second edition of the Academy of Realist Art Boston's Ask Me Anything. I'm hoping that people will start calling it ARA AMA because that's going to be like the new thing. So I appreciate you joining us, and those of you who submitted questions in advance, that's also appreciated because we can kind of prepare in a way, but I'm also obviously happy to answer questions off the cuff. And so what I'll do is I'll start with people who maybe have their hand raised so that, and then if I'll eventually get to the ones that were submitted in advance as well. And actually, I'll start with Lori. Lori, because you did submit a question in advance, but you also have your hand raised. So Lori, do you want, is the question you have your hand raised for, is that one the same as the one that you submitted?
Well, yeah, and I also have one other that's not as urgent, so I don't want to hog up all your time. So why don't we go with the one I asked first? And if there is
Okay.
time, yeah.
Okay, great. Oh, there's like a weird speech bubble that just came up. Okay, anyways, so I'll just kind of read a quick summary of your question for those of you who obviously didn't get that email. Lori asked that she's been asked to give a 90-minute talk on the process of oil painting to basically complete newbies, like a local crafting group. And she's wondering, if, that she's creating a basic outline, maybe things that are do or do nots for people who have never approached oil painting before. Now, first of all, Lori, if you wanted to, I'm happy to provide. I do have my oil painting fundamentals PDF that if you want to use that as either a resource or reference or copy and paste from it, totally fine with that. You can find that the intro to oil painting, I believe that's on my Gumroad. That's a free download. So if you check out my Gumroad, I'm Julie Be Creative on Gumroad. You can find that free handout for intro to oil painting. But just in general theory, I think when you're approaching people who've never oil painted before, I think it's helpful to express the complexities of oil paint and that there's a couple kind of training wheels that you can put on the medium in order to better understand what's happening and why. So the challenges of oil paint is also the thing that makes it kind of amazing. So a lot of people usually have dabbled in watercolor or acrylics, and both are water-based. And that means they dry incredibly quickly. Unfortunately, but also awesomely with oil paints is we have the trouble of drying time. Now that can be really beneficial because it means that you're not stuck with what you put down 10 minutes ago. Everything's still workable for probably the full day. So that can be both a plus and a minus. It can be challenging. So I think you just want to make sure that people leave with the understanding that the drying time is definitely going to be an issue. And because things stay wet on the canvas and palette, you're going to have a lot more chances for colors to get muddy because anytime you take two colors and you mix them, their chroma is going to drop. So the intensity of the color. So you get a lot of times when I see beginners painting, they're doing a lot of mixing on the canvas, but kind of not with intention. It's kind of this like, I kind of joke that when people paint, they think this is painting. Like you should just always be doing this with the brush. Okay, technically, yes, you're putting paint on the canvas, but you're actually more smearing it around. And so that's usually the problem. So I would say that the things for them to take away is the drying time is going to be an issue and that you don't have to do it all in one go. So also the fact that the layering can bring in this really beautiful element of oil paint, and that is using it in layers and just make sure it's fully dry before you're painting on it again. So if you just get across the basic information that it's harder to control because it stays wet, but you don't need to do it all in one go. That's, to me, one of the biggest takeaways of understanding oil paint, and that you can get amazing effects when you're working with transparent layers on transparent layers, but it's also harder to control and predict what's going to happen. So when we first train at the academy, when people begin oil painting, we do it strictly with opaque application. So what you see on your palette is what you get on your surface. So if people are just starting, I highly recommend learning how to use the paint in an opaque way. So that means that, this is my miming for transparency. This is opacity. So you're kind of doing opaque on opaque, and that is a lot easier to control and predict because you're literally like saying a new thing each layer. But with opacity, you're kind of at the mercy of kind of what's happening. Okay, does that make sense? Does that kind of like
Totally.
give you a basic framework? And just, assume you're teaching it to like a 16-year-old, even though
Yeah.
they're adults. Just, try to think of basic concepts. That would be my biggest suggestion for that.
Okay. That really helps. And thanks for pointing me. I'll find your PDF. That's
Yeah.
great.
Yeah. And there's, I think, 3 other PDFs that are free for download on my Gumroad. So if anybody who does any type of teaching, please do not be afraid to use those as resources or use them in your classrooms or use them for whatever, because to me, it's information that everybody should have. And somebody gave me that information and it's super valuable and powerful. So you're welcome to just take my branding off of it and just copy and paste it. Honestly, it's super helpful information. And it really is what gave me the courage to come back into oil painting after giving up on it when I was a lot younger.
Wow. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, great.
I'll talk later with the next question, unless you just told me to ask it now.
Why don't you ask it now? Do you feel like it's like a quick question?
Very quick. Well, I hope it's a quick question. You tell me. What are your, like, if you can,
5K.
hello.
Can everybody make sure that they're muted if they're not asking a question? We're hearing some background noise.
So I'm expecting to get paid finally for a painting, and I want to treat myself with a new tube of paint or so. And I want to know what do you feel is one or more of the most useful colors for portrait painting? I don't mean this to be a hard question, but I mean,
well, could you tell me what your existing palette, do you have a standard palette that you're used to working with?
well, basically most of the stuff that ARA has recommended in their supply lists. I've got pretty much everything Eric loves. So yeah.
Okay, so I mean, my standard palette is my lead white, cad yellow from Michael Harding, yellow ochre, raw umber. Then I've got cad red light, alizarin crimson permanent, burnt umber, ultramarine blue, ivory black, and then my special color, which is outside of the standard ARA full palette, would be Vasari's cobalt brilliant turquoise or something. So
that's where I was going. Okay, that's what I was looking for.
Yeah. So that's like my it used to be Winsor Newton's bright cobalt bright turquoise or something. That was a good color. That's what I kind of started in with. And then I learned from Alan Williams, who's a really amazing illustrator / fine artist. And I think he had went to one of Graydon Parrish's workshops, and he's like, the highest chroma teal you can get is this Vasari brilliant turquoise. And I was like, purchase. So that was why I added it. It also rounds out my blues, is because ultramarine blue is a purpley dark blue. Ivory black is a low chroma dark blue. And I wanted a lighter, greener blue to really round out my capabilities in the blue color space. So that's why I like that. It's extreme. So it's not, okay, I do use it a little bit straight out of the tube, but like in really select like places. So I like that color, but I mean, most of the high chromas are a little like kooky for portraits. But I mean, if you look at like Antonio Lonis, who's one of our instructors, he just did this really cool self-portrait. And when you look at it up close, he's got these really shocking high chroma notes of reds and pinks and blues. But when you stand back, it all reads. I mean, that's really kind of impressionism when you think about it, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, I could say like dioxazine purple, but like that might work for me. But for in general, like the way you're using the color is really going to determine what would be like the most useful. You know, you could do a portrait in Zorn palette, and that I find I love doing Zorn palette for my like alla prima portraits because I just need to do, I don't mind the stunted language. I can do it really quickly, and it's less like thinking about it.
Right. Okay, thank you. I'm
Okay,
excited.
great questions. Okay, I'm going to go with Alberta next. So Alberta, if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, so nice to have you here. Okay, so I'm doing the value scale now, and I have to draw it out on a piece of, that Canson paper, that special paper.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure I got the front, which is actually the back.
So
Right?
so the Canson has a smoother side and a more textured honeycomb-ish side,
Mm-hmm.
and it's the smooth side you want.
Yeah, which is actually the back side. Okay, so
good to know.
as far as they're concerned.
Yeah.
And now when I draw that out, because I want to make it nicely measured on the paper,
Yeah.
do I use a pen
to draw the boxes?
Yeah.
I would use just the pencil. So, you know, you can use a ruler and you can just to create those kind of like, you know, 1 inch by 1 inch boxes.
Yep.
Just make sure they're not touching because you don't want simultaneous contrast. You want to have that little bit of space. I would just use pencil because part of what you're also exploring when you're doing the value scale like that is you're exploring, like, let's say you were filling a shape in on your bark drawing. And you know, when you fill in, you don't have to like totally stick within the boundary because you can also use the eraser to kind of clean up the edges. So I would just use pencil because it's going to be a little bit more like what you're experiencing in the actual drawing itself in a way.
Okay.
So use pencil, and then even if you're as you're kind of you know, blocking in or kind of like I call it glazing, like glazing in the values to start or just to get some application, and you go over the lines. It's really not that big of a deal if you go past it because you're going to actually have to be practicing
Cleaning it up
in a way.
Yeah. Okay. So I hope they don't get bendy, but that's okay. That's what I'm practicing.
That's what, yeah, that, I mean, things get bendy and then we have to unbend them.
That's it.
I also did, so somebody also asked in the chat about my Gumroad. So I just linked my Gumroad into the chat there.
Okay. I also want to tell you that it was nice to watch one of your videos when you were doing site size, because I noticed how you're holding your measuring thing. Really huge for me because I was having so much trouble. I couldn't get comfortable. Plus, but your hands are a lot different from anyone else's because they're yours. So I'm still working with my own hands, but to see you do that was really enlightening.
I'd like to be able to rent out my hands.
Yeah, your hands are really great.
No, so, well, it's okay. What you're talking about actually covers a lot of like painters as well, because what you're talking about right now is the mechanics, like the physical mechanics of how you use tools. We are all very, very different. And the bark drawing is really great, and doing site size drawing is, I think, powerful because it kind of puts all these training wheels on in which the mechanics are minimally getting in the way. So kind of how I achieve, you know, site size with the bark drawings or using the pencils, the variables are a little bit smaller, but when we get to working from life site size, the variables are a lot larger. Part of it is like how stable you are in your joints. I'm not very good at drawing from my shoulder, so I tend to draw more from my elbow and my wrist. And so I need to compensate for that. And that means I might need to change things about what I do. And we've also structured the program. Well, we didn't structure it. We kind of like built it on other people's. But anyways, the way we approach going from graphite to charcoal to paint is actually a graduation of challenges of working with different mechanics. Pencil is easy. It's a little bit more straightforward. When you get to charcoal, people's mechanics are really, really different because it's a much different medium. So the way that I use charcoal, I hate charcoal, but it's a necessary evil, is like, I tend to really like using the little tortillons, and I like to use the sharpened charcoals and a pottery sponge, whereas some other people like a badger brush. So the mechanics start to really become personal. And then, as many painters know, how we physically hold the paintbrush is so dramatically different from person to person. How our brain and eyes connect to our hands. You have to start, being comfortable exploring and experimenting within, like, I know what the target goal is, but how am I going to achieve that
Yeah.
with how I relate to my materials?
Yeah. Yeah. I also noticed that you use the pencil when you're measuring horizontally, and you use the stick
Yeah,
when you go vertical.
exactly. And that's part of like laziness.
Okay.
So, and I always tell people, like, try to like get more comfortable measuring with your less dominant hand, because you're going to
Yeah.
you want this kind of quick
Yeah.
response. Now,
Right.
I'm mostly encouraging that you're using your eyeballs first, and the measuring is more of like a backup to what your eyes are telling you.
Yeah.
But still, like, it can get really awkward if you're like measuring with your right hand or like checking something, and then you have to kind of put it down and then
Yeah. But
walk
you
up.
don't do that. You measure and then you take your hand off and then you go for the dot. You don't even
Right.
mix the two.
Yeah.
You keep your eye like a hawk.
Well, I think it's also partly that I don't want to trust the measurement too much. Like, the
Okay.
measurements meant to get me in the ballpark.
Ballpark. Right.
The process and repetition, I want
Right.
everybody to really be thinking is look, mark, look, measure, and then adjust. So notice
Yeah.
that the measuring came last,
I like that. Yeah. I think that
because if you're measure, mark, look,
there's no hope.
your brain's already
There's
checked
no
out.
hope. Yeah. There's no hope.
Your brain's like,
Yeah.
screw this.
Yeah. Tea time.
Yeah. So it's look, guess. This is a
Mhm.
theory. Look, mark. This is my guess. Look, because
Yeah.
your eye is actually much more accurate than you think. So if you look and you're really asking yourself, like, how does that feel? I know we say we don't draw what we feel, but in a
Mhm.
way, I'm asking you to tap into how it feels.
Mhm.
And if it doesn't feel right, there's no even point in measuring, right? Then you change it so it feels right. Then you measure it. And if there's a discrepancy, it's a feedback loop for your
Wow.
brain.
Okay.
Okay.
Great. Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Really does. Yeah.
Okay, great.
So informative. I love what you said, and I'm glad I came to the Ask Me Anything.
Great. All right, wonderful. Okay, so
Thank
I
you.
will go to Natalie next. I know Natalie said that you had a touchy-feely question and a technical question.
Yeah, I wanted to give you an option in case you didn't want the touchy-feely question.
Okay, I don't mind either.
I'll ask the technical question first because it actually dovetails with what you were speaking about earlier. One of the things that I love about your painting is the way you use color and high chroma, and especially where you are working in the halation area around a spectral highlight. Like, I've noticed you will use multi-chroma hues around that area.
Yes.
So I was wondering if you could say which hues by brand that you like to use and why you're using more than one chroma selection to boost the chroma in a halation.
Oh, okay. So I know Natalie's using a lot of technical terms that many people might not understand.
I can make it really simple.
No, but I can also talk about that. So let me see if I'm going to bring up my textures workshop, because I kind of cover this in
I'm thinking
that.
specifically even about that knob that you posted just the other day. Like, I can see in the halation, I'm like, oh my God, it's blue, it's purple, it's like pink, like all this color.
Exactly. Okay, so let me grab this. So yeah, so the specular highlight, for those of you who may not understand what that is, a specular highlight is like when you have a shiny object, something that's like almost fully reflective in some way. So a glossy porcelain vase, for example, or a mirror is like a full something, anything metallic is going to have specular highlights. It's these like really pinpointy, very reflective sections. And it can be really challenging, especially with white objects, to create a highlight, because that specular highlight is literally the light reflecting back at you from the original light source. And the problem is that you only have white paint. And that white paint does not get very bright compared to fully reflected light. Okay. So that's an issue. So what we need to do is figure out how to translate that visual information. So obviously, if I'm doing a specular highlight, I just need to make my pure white paint that highlight, and everything else around it needs to be darker, even if it looks darker than what I see in real life, because painting is a translation of reality. It's an interpretation. We don't have the same language. So think of it as like translating, you know, English to Spanish or German to French. Like it's a complete change of language. And so when we use the language of paint, there are some illusions that we can simulate that can force our brains to think that we're using a wider language. And Chroma is one of those things that I use to accentuate things and make things look brighter than they appear. Okay, so I'm going to bring up, this is like a very extreme example, but it works for glass or metal. This is kind of like smoke and mirrors. And once you see this in one of my paintings, you'll never not be able to see it. There we go. Okay, so in terms of, especially like with highlights, and I can also bring up a picture of the painting that Natalie's talking about. So when I kind of stumbled on this on accident, I tend to find accidental things happening, and then I simulate them, but then I usually later on understand why they work. So one of the things I found was when I was seeing a bright white object, not shiny even, just a bright white object on a black background or a dark background. I think I first noticed this when I was painting in my tenebrism assignment at the school, which is tenebrism is kind of like Caravaggio-esque, where it's light and dark pattern, really dramatics. And so you might have some really dramatic brights in front of a dark. And when I noticed that in real life, I always felt like there was this kind of haze around the white object or the brighter object that wasn't like, that kind of not obscured the edge, but kind of had this almost glowing feel, like you can feel the light coming off of that surface. And so I started actually putting a blue object, a blue paint surface around because I'm like addicted to chroma. So I was like, well, I just kind of experimented, and I found that putting this chromatic teal blue on the edge, right as the bright object was hitting the black surface, it kind of gave me that simulation. So technically, I know that what's happening is not only am I getting a transition is a step in between two very different values, or like how you combine two very different values. So I found that this blue actually gave me a transition from the bright object to the background that gave it kind of this glowing ethereal feel without it kind of obscuring the edge. So I could still keep it shapy, the shape that it needed to be, but it allowed it to really make it feel like what I feel like I see in real life. Okay, so that's how that started. And then when I was starting to do highlights, I realized that the blue was helping. Like I would do that actually a little bit. I would actually mix white and blue together and kind of hug the highlight. So it does the kind of the same thing, even without being on onto a black background, but it gave me this kind of sparkly, colorful transition from that bright highlight to the next value down, which not only kind of hugged it with a darker value. So that blue is darker than the white. So anytime that you surround something with, you know, something darker, it's going to appear lighter. You've seen this optical illusion all the time where it's like these two squares are exactly the same, but if you surround it with light or dark, your perception of it changes. So I'm kind of I like using this kind of hugging the highlight with some additional mid-value information to help make that highlight feel brighter. But it also, that Chroma simulates what I realize now, the more research I did into it after the fact, was that there's something called chromatic aberration. Okay. And that is kind of how the light splits. You've probably seen it in your car all the time when you when the light's coming through your not your dashboard, the big piece of glass windshield. You see, when light comes through your windshield, it actually splits a little bit. And I noticed this in my car where you could see this really chromatic blue on the edge of that light. And on the other side, I started to see this kind of orangey red. So I was like, well, what if I do that in my painting? So the next time I had a really bright specular highlight, I kind of, you know, turned up the volume on it. And I did this kind of specular highlight where I said, I'm going to hug it on one side with the orangey red and the kind of teal blue on either side. You can see what that's happening here when light splits. So that to me was like, when I stepped back, it like started to really read. And it's just because when you're up close, you can see the individual, again, like Impressionism. When you're up close, you can actually see the separate statements. But when you step back at a regular viewing distance, it simulates the experience that you're looking for in terms of a highlight like that. So I also combine that with, for my specular highlights, I know Natalie, you do this too, is the building up the actual highlight itself. So when I go to put an actual highlight on, sometimes I'll kind of lay a little bed of like the red and the blue, and then I'll use a little bit of stand oil with my lead white. Now, stand oil has some nice body to it. It's a little bit more like honey, and it kind of self levels itself. So it won't like hold sharp brush strokes. It kind of like silly putty, like ends up in a glob. So, so what I'm trying to do is not only help myself out by surrounding that highlight with something a little bit darker and adding these little pops of chroma, but I'm also physically trying to create like a bulb, which might actually catch a highlight from the actual light. And I noticed that from going to see a show of William Merritt Chase. And it was really obvious because, again, you got to see paintings in person to really understand what's happening. He had this metal ball, like it was like a bell of something. And when you looked at the paint, it looked so shiny. And when I realized I got up close, it was like a whole gigantic, thick impasto, shiny bell. And the highlights were actually highlights from the lights in the museum. Right. So he's kind of like not only creating the illusion by, you know, what he surrounds things by, but he's creating a physical simulation because he's allowing the presence of a light source to help him create a brighter highlight. So the chroma in itself, I find chroma is a great way to create transitions, especially around highlights. So it might not be bold red and bold turquoise. So I'm using my Cobalt Brilliant Turquoise from Vasari, obviously. But I usually add some white to it to get the value up a little bit higher. And then I'll usually use my Cad Red light, my Holbein Cad Red light, which is a nice orangey red, but when you add a lot of white to it, it does pink up a bit more So I'm not creating a dramatic value drop like in that white knob. I can't just put on CAD red light because that's going to be too dramatic of a difference, because I'm dropping down to like a gray white for the knob color. Does that make sense? And so you'll also see, like, if you look at Jeremy Lipking's work, he's using actually his like a fingerprint of a transition color is like a violet. So I tend to use turquoise as a transition color. And if something's not working, I just try turquoise. So, so I wonder if I have examples of that. Maybe I can find a couple. Does that answer your question, Natalie, in terms of the
yeah.
technical?
No, that's very cool. I love the diagram. That's awesome. Thank you.
You know, actually, I'm a little teapot might work. Let me get that one open. I'm a little teapot.
Yeah, I was totally knocked out by your waist knob. So I figured that was a good question.
It is a good question. So I'll zoom in. Let's see. Let's share this one. And I can sometimes just do it on like a micro level. So, you know, I'm doing it here. You can see I'm doing it here. I'm a one-trick pony.
That looks awesome.
Right. So like there are places that I have pure pigment that I'm using pure, like this is probably pretty, maybe pure turquoise, but I find that those little pieces can be really special when you're like seeing a painting in person. Obviously online it's a little bit more challenging because you see it in such a small space. Oh, there's one other one actually. Let me grab Creation of Eve. This one was like pretty heavy with it. Okay. Oh, so I mean, turquoise, turquoise. Well, even on the hand, like turquoise, red, like just transitioning, like, but you know, it doesn't read obnoxious. If we go to the whoops, like, So okay, see, turquoise that's my special color, but you can see I'm doing it basically on almost every highlight. I'm using like major chroma to like create that turning of the form there. I just feel like it brings a lot of liveliness to it. And then this one is like really crazy. I mean, it's great for metallics, I think. Okay, does that I feel like those visuals, I'm happy to send you like the high res if you wanted to look more at that, but I feel like everything is like red on one side, blue on the other. I'm giving away all my secrets. But yeah, Lipking uses a lot of this low chroma violet. And if you look at the way he's transitioning from like skin to hair, I think artists tend to have those like patterns. Okay. Did you want to do the touchy-feely question?
Yeah, and I'll make this quick because I know other people have questions, but my touchy-feely question, something that I get asked a lot, is advice for artists, but I want to ask you a specific question, which is, I really found the time transitioning out of being a student and being into professional artist really tough. So like that is a really hard time. And I'm just wondering what's your answer for that? Like, how do you make that transition? What can you do to help that along, moving from student to professional?
I feel like I'm still in that transition.
I'm going to mute myself.
I mean, okay, in a way, I feel like it's like anything you're learning, right? It's at first like really hard, but then it kind of does this, but it's always continuing up. right? You never actually plateau. I mean, if you're plateauing, I think there's a problem. But usually it's, you don't know who you are. It's like the teenager years of being an artist. I feel like when maybe you're training, or maybe you went to art school, or maybe like you're, even just starting, I'm putting like the technical stuff aside, right? Like learning how to paint physically. Because I do think that it is valuable to spend some time focused on that to a degree, so that when you do start figuring out what you want to make and why, you're able to focus. Because I think it's really, some people might be able to balance those things. I was not really great at balancing those things. And I didn't feel like I knew I wanted to be doing like certain amount of complexity in my work, but my skills weren't up to snuff. So it wasn't even worth me trying to do these complex stuff, because my actual skills I knew were nowhere near they needed to be. And I was very fortunate that I, stumbled on this type of training, the Academy of Realist Art Boston, because it was something that actually gave me a language to use. I was not happy with other languages. I tried abstraction and I got yelled at by my teacher, and and like it just didn't feel right to me, and I just kept coming back to like realism or representational work. And what I know now is my drawing just wasn't there, and so I couldn't get past a certain point. But once I kind of felt confident to a basic degree of technical ability, then it was kind of like, oh, you graduated the program, or you got your degree. Now what? I call that the black hole of your artistic life. So the black hole is a very scary and challenging time, I think, for everybody. And it's unfortunate, because I always said there should be like a grad school for after atelier programs, or there should be, what do I do now? You're kind of like lost in the ether. And that's challenging. That is, and it's very emotionally, I think, a raw place, because you're like, I know I can do things, I just don't know what to make. So my what worked for me, and what I see in other people, is I do think it's important to stay connected to a community of people who can not only kind of keep you accountable to continue on that journey, but to also inspire you. And as much as I hate to admit that, my mother was right, but it does matter who you surround yourself with. As a teenager, I didn't know that. I didn't agree with her, but now I do, because I've matured somewhat. So I do think it matters who you surround yourself with. If you assume that you're going to become like the people you surround yourself with. So I would always suggest try to be the small fish in the big pond. Yes, that's right. Don't, be a big fish in a small pond can like have its advantages, but it won't challenge you enough. And so it doesn't necessarily have to be painters. It could be just other creatives, or other artists, or dancers, or musicians, or just people who are dedicated to making. Because really the biggest important thing that you do during that black hole time is just make. You have to make work, and you have to continually explore who you are. Sometimes that means like looking at what other people doing and saying, hey, I like that. Maybe I want to try something similar. Or I really like that too. So maybe I want to try something like that. Maybe, play around with your process. So it becomes this really like you're like almost like a teenager tries on different personalities. Like today I'm goth, tomorrow I decide I'm going to be preppy. You kind of have to do that with your own artwork, and that requires you to do and make. And one recommendation I would have is to not overwhelm yourself with massive projects, because I think the best thing is to kind of get this, like, try something, react to it in the real world, try something, react to it in the real world. So if you're taking on a really big, overwhelming project, it can be really easy to stall, because if you decide partway through, you don't know if you like it, everybody's different. So this is just my, asterisks that This is my suggestion. But I think the more you can kind of make and see it in the real world and see if it feels gratifying to you, if the process feels gratifying, if the outcome feels gratifying, if the subject feels gratifying, right? That's a lot of stuff to figure out, and to do it and know what that's going to be right out of the gate is probably impossible. You will evolve. And so I think finding, Natalie, you evolved I think in a similar fashion, where you come out of maybe training or school doing things that you feel comfortable with. Like, I know I can do this. And what if I do something even bigger and complicated? And maybe I try a little bit of this, but you start to find these like branches that start to feel interesting and exploring. And then things are going to start to click, or things are going to start to repeat, or you're going to keep coming back to the same things because you're exploring your relationship to those things, or this type of portrait or that type of thing. So you just have to like do to experience, and continually expose yourself to other work being done. But also the big thing is stay connected. And I think stuff like this helps. I think finding local people who are in your geographically local space. There's a lot of artist group who just meet online and paint while they're online together. Be a part of a community. That's a really big motivator. And actually the only reason I started painting again in my 20s was because I joined a meetup called the Art Motivation Group. I met a wonderful girl named Harmony, and that was it. I was a painter again. It was fabulous.
Very cool. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Okay. Yeah. So if you're new to the group, all you have to do is raise your hand if you have a question. And then I'm just, Alberta, can you lower your hand? Cause you already asked your question, unless you had another one. Okay. So let's see. I will go to Patricia next. Hi, Patricia.
Hey, Julie, how are you?
Good. Thanks for coming.
Well, thank you for having this. This is really great. I love hearing everybody's questions. I have a bit of a technical question. So, we use mineral spirits to create our imprimatur, campitura, and also to do if we're doing painting, construct our preliminary drawing on the canvas.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't want to use mineral spirits, what options do we have to do our imprimatura or to do our construct on our painting if we don't want to use mineral spirits of any kind?
Okay. So absolutely, a lot of people don't want to use solvents, and totally understandable. So you can still use all the same processes, but you're just going to be considering, like, how do we loosen up our paint? And if we're not going to use a solvent, we need to use, we need to add something to our paint that's either A, going to be fast drying, or just B, cause it to loosen up. The most basic answer is you could just use a little bit of oil.
Okay.
Right. So you're painting, if you're, let's say you want to tone your canvas, but you don't want to try to scrub all this really dry paint off. You could just add some oil to it and just make sure you kind of buff it out and make it really thin. So a thin layer is going to dry very quickly. And if you're using an earth tone or something that's going to be a fast dryer, you're just going to want to make sure you give it more time than you would solvent to dry to use it. Okay, so that's just like, again, if we use our basic materials at ARA Boston, which is we only use a little bit of solvent for toning and maybe the first layer, or, if we're not, the only other thing that we add in our program is oil. So we try to keep it really simple, because if you can do it with the basics, you can do it with anything else. Another medium you could use is something like Gelkid. So Gelkid is a lot like an oil, but it's a little bit thicker. So again, you're dealing with the consistency of the paint. So a Gelkid is going to be a faster dryer, but it's a little bit, I'd say, denser or like more honey-like. I would prefer just linseed oil, because I know linseed oil is fast drying. If you do a thin enough layer and it's going to dry pretty quickly. But you don't have to use solvent. I actually hate using solvent just because I hate how it makes the paint act, but I do like it for toning a canvas.
Okay, and for if you're doing your, sketching in your construct, your preliminary drawing on a painting, would you do the same thing?
So you mean
use-
like a block in?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, a block and same thing. So I would probably try to use just the paint, and you're going to be using kind of a scrubby motion.
Yep.
So, use a brush that you don't, maybe more of a bristle that you don't care too much about.
Right.
I would use that bristle, and I would really pressure, pressure is really important with, especially with that first layer. If you're just, sketching it in, being really light to stay light with the lines. And then only until you start to commit to areas, get a little bit darker with a little bit more pressure. But same thing, if you want it to be a little bit more loose, just a little bit more oil. We're talking like a couple of drops and see how it acts. You don't want to be dumping a bunch of oil in at the beginning.
Okay.
Okay.
All
So
right.
again, thin, and you can always, just give it additional drying time,
Okay.
than you would for a solvent.
Great. Thanks. Thanks
Yep.
very much.
Yeah, of course. Okay. Lucy.
Hi. I think I saw on Instagram it was your birthday recently, so happy
It was on
belated
Monday.
birthday.
Thank you.
Woo!
I reached level 43.
Yes. Every year is a privilege, right?
Yeah.
So my question is, I was hoping for feedback on a color study. Would it be all right if I sent you the link?
Yeah, why don't you, if we have time, I'll do visual critiques for things. So if you want to email that to me, oh, you sent me a link. Great. I'll just download that. But for now, if we can, maybe I'll do visual critiques towards the end. Did you have another question?
Oh, no, I'll just wait till the end.
Okay. All right. That sounds good. Okay. Thanks. Next I will go to Borna.
Hi, Julie.
Hi.
Thanks for making this session and explaining everything to us. I have a question, although I forgot a question, but I wrote it down. And I would like to ask you about your shadows. Your shadows seems as if they are on a whole different level. What I mean by it is, well, your last painting with pipe that's pouring water on Instagram, your last Instagram
Yes.
post. Shadows seems like, even the shadow seems as if they have color to it, as if they have
do.
life to it. And that's what I'm trying to ask you, is how do you mix these colors, and how do you mix them, and which aspects influence shadows in relation to color usage? How do you use black in order to use shadow?
Good question. Okay, so what I'm going to try to do is grab the pictures I posted, and so that I can pull them up on the screen. Actually, maybe I'll just pull up my Instagram here. That might be easier. We'll flip through them. Okay, so I'm just going to share my screen here. Okay, so when you're talking about the shadows here,
yeah, even the previous picture of you just establishing the shadows, they seem vibrant as well here. And
yes.
then you just progress the same visual style until you reached the picture on the left, which is live, which is an actual thing, I think.
Yes. Okay, so when I'm establishing, I'm using indirect painting, which means I'm using 3 layers, and in these shadows, it's 3 layers of mostly opaque application. Okay, so I'm mixing the color I want. Now, when you're seeing my first layer here, this is actually kind of thin. And so the reason I'm getting extra chroma is the intensity or the colorfulness of the color. The reason that this looks more colorful is because I have some transparency in the paint. So Patricia and I were just talking about how when we're first blocking things in, we sometimes use a little bit of solvent because our first layer, we don't want it to have physical texture. and we don't want it to have buildup, and we don't want to have sharp edges. So you can kind of see all of that existing here in this first layer. So I have the tone of the canvas, which you can actually see peeking through in many of these areas, right? So you can kind of see through the paint, okay? Anytime we take a dark value and we transparently put it over a lighter value that's dry, we're going to get a boost in chroma. Okay.
Oh, but like you're using blacks.
No,
in
I'm
order
not
to do
using
that.
black there. So that's a very
Okay.
common thing to assume. And the painting is all about challenging our assumptions. So when I make a shadow value, actually, let me go to also my, whoops, get out of my way. No, a block. That's what I meant. Okay. So if you go to my palette, my standard palette,
Yeah.
what I want you to notice about the colors that I have on my palette at all times, there are four values on my palette that are dark, right? So we have raw umber, we have burnt umber, we have alizarin crimson, ultramarine blue, and ivory black. Those are all four very dark colors out of the tube, right? Okay. So when I make a dark shadow that is on a light brown piece of paper, black is not the best option. Okay.
Is the black option best option in any
Absolutely. Black is a very valuable color. So this color right here is likely a mixture of black and burnt umber, because that forces now black is a low chroma dark blue, right? So if I take a low chroma dark blue and I only put that down here, it might look a little too cold for me. So I like black because black is really dark. But for this shadow, I actually wanted to have a little bit of warmth here. So I actually mixed the burnt umber and the ivory black to make my shadow value in the green. But for the paper, I do not want to use black in that if I can avoid it, because the black is very cold and my paper is this kind of light brown. And so the shadow value in the paper needs to be a lot lighter than the shadow value on the dark wood. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. It
Okay.
makes perfectly sense. But which colors are you using in the paper
In the
section?
paper, probably, I would assume a burnt umber, probably a little bit of yellow, cad yellow, because it shifts it a little bit lighter. Burnt umber, I think, was a little bit too dark for this shadow value right now. So it's probably mostly, I'd say 90% burnt umber with maybe like 10%, 5% cad yellow, maybe 5% cad red light.
Oh, and when you're progressing with the painting over and over, you're just adding the same colors, or are you making any adjustments to the color palette?
Good question. It depends. If I try the exact same color mixture and it looks right, then I'm great. Then I'm good. But if I try that same color mixture, so the second layer has full opacity now because I have this underneath it. This is like a big step towards what it's going to look like. When I go to my second layer, I'm going to try again that same color mixture. And if it doesn't work, I don't keep it. Okay. A lot of painting is improvisation. Okay. So I probably, with the dark shadow, I probably mixed again that really dark ivory black and burnt umber mixture. And that's kind of my key. Do you understand what I mean when I say a key?
Not really, but
Okay.
I grabbed the concept of going forward with the same individual colors until you build up the whole painting in general. But that was my main question of how did you get this particular shadow?
So, okay. So, but the concept of the key is really important for you to understand.
Okay.
So when I say a key, what I want you to be considering a key is something that you compare everything else to. So in this instance, one of the things, whenever I'm doing a color study or whenever I'm doing a painting, I need to consider my extremes. And so we talked earlier about how we are using a stunted language in painting. It does not have the same language as reality, right?
Okay.
So
Yeah.
we need to make sure that we are considering the capabilities of our paint. And so in this instance, the dark shadow on the wood is my key. It's the thing that is the darkest dark that is going to be
Okay.
on this painting. So I'm going to consider that to be a non-changeable entity. So when I make that value of the shadow on the dark wood, that's can't change. So what I need to do is make sure that the shadow value in the paper needs to work with whatever that key is in my painting. So I'm not matching, I'm not trying to like do something perfectly. I need to match the relationship, not just the value. And it almost doesn't even matter what paints I use. I need to just make sure that visually on the canvas, those two sections, these two colors have to work together. And so if I put this down and I try that same mixture that worked for this layer and it doesn't look right, I need to change it. Okay. So, but I'm not using white in my shadows. Typically, I'm not using really bright values because I need to make sure it stays dark enough, but I need warmth in there, which is why it's very burnt umber heavy.
Are you using, yeah, I could, yeah, okay, yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay.
Yeah,
That
okay.
answers your question. So it's really about controlling values and understanding relationships and reacting once you start putting paint on the canvas. I just try, and you've probably seen my videos, right? I put a little brush stroke and then I step back because I need to try it. Again, we talked about this with Laura, or with, I forgot who it was. You make a mark, you put something down, you look, you assess it, and if it's working, keep going. If it's not, change it.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay. And then Angela.
Julie, excuse me. Thank you so much for doing this. So my question is about kind of like that stage of learning skills, improving your technique. And if you're someone like myself who it's not in the cards to do any technical instruction right now, and I'm doing the self-taught route, do you have any recommended like approaches, like, you know, where to focus time on and or resources besides obviously everything you've offered up, doing this and, you know, everything you have available on Gumroad, that kind of stuff, like how to focus it to improve skills.
Focus it.
Yeah.
Okay. So I guess one thing I would like to say is kind of like what is your background and kind of what are your goals?
Right. Well, yeah, for me personally, so I started, as you said, most people start with watercolors or acrylics. I had started casually with watercolors, and now I'm diving into oils and kind of learning how they feel, how to work with them. You know, in grad school, started with sort of like you said, an art enthusiast club where I started like getting back into drawing. It was like, oh, wow, I can draw. This is fun. So I was in a science industry, not art focused, and just sort of, yeah, I'm a intermediate, reasonable drawer and watercolorist and getting into oils now.
Okay. And so, and what are your goals? Are you looking to, I'm assuming representational art and realism is kind of like where you're headed down.
Right. I do have a natural inclination towards that. I'm probably still in that teenage years where I'm simultaneously exploring technical development as well as, you know, what I want to paint.
Okay. And then do you feel like leaning more portraits? Like, do you feel like, or is there figurative or anything or still life or landscape?
Honestly, right now, everything gets me excited. So
okay. I mean,
it's sort of like, it's like all the things, I have so many ideas, but I am like, how do I focus this?
Yeah, same. I completely agree. Okay. So my suggestion would be, I mean, obviously there's a lot of information out there, which can be like, not agree with each other. So, I mean, practicing drawing is always like, when you're working realistically or representationally, painting is just drawing with another medium. But there's ways that we can kind of take exercises and isolate some of those technical skills, but it can also help you in other capacity. So one thing that I think would be really useful is doing color studies of artists that you like. So that does a couple things. Number one is the color studies. If you're, I don't, have you like have you done my color boot camp ever, or have you, or have seen some of the videos? Because I have a couple of free videos on YouTube about color studies.
Yeah, I've seen some of those.
Okay. So doing a color study of a masterwork or of artists that you really like does two things. Number one, it forces you to practice working in relationships, just like we were just talking about. It forces you to kind of focus on the technical side of how you're physically applying paint to the canvas, how to work with opacity and not just kind of noodling around. It forces you to control what you're doing. And so those color studies, so you can also focus on the technical, but you're also kind of accidentally thinking about, because you have to simplify color studies. You can't just, you're not making a little painting. It's a study of information. So what that also does is it kind of forces you into seeing it more abstractly. So it allows for you to understand what the artist is doing compositionally, value structure wise. So certain artists will work in different value structures. So, not hitting the darkest language possible. Like impressionists tend to not hit the darkest language possible of oil paints. Or maybe you like Caravaggio, which kind of takes the value scale and like really does more this type of thing. So you start to understand like what you're responding to visually with other artists, and also practicing with paint at the same time. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Another thing I would also suggest is, so the color studies are those smaller exercises. They're really bite-sized. You can usually do them in like one pass, great, but maybe 2 passes to make modifications. They're fast, they're easy. I can always give you recommendations on like, if you want to have them printed. I do think it's better to have them printed out than also trying to do some from the screen, because that is a really different experience. So that's going to help technically with the paint itself, but then also having a project like a self-portrait, right? So it's not necessarily a big creative project, but it's an instance in which you can work from life and not have to pay a model. B, it forces you to think about setup and composition in terms of like the lighting on your face and creating like a reasonable single light source situation that you can work from. There's no timeline. It's kind of open-ended. So I think doing these projects, but also like, I don't know about like how much you can afford in terms of like, if you took one of our online atelier program classes like once a week, it can really help. I find eyeballs are really helpful. That was the big game changer for me, was having somebody else with trained eyeballs to show me what I wasn't seeing in a way. And then like, once you see those things, you can't unsee them. So you might find that could be useful, but again, I don't know what your availability is, but I think any way that you can continue trying to develop your drawing sense is good in a somewhat structured way, whether it's with our online program or something else that kind of serves that purpose. But also in terms of painting, a lot of it is just experience. And so, there's tons of great workshops that are out there that you can just go play with the paint kind of in a structured way. But a lot of it's just doing and understanding cause and effect. And you can actually get a lot of that information from like some of my free PDFs and stuff like that. I'm always happy if you're like, have a question outside of this, you're always, welcome to email me and ask. because it's not always obvious as to what's happening, or like, I don't understand why I tried this, but this is what happened. Or like, you know, there's usually a pretty good exercise that you can kind of break out and focus on in order to get better at a very specific skill. Does
Awesome.
that make sense?
Yes, that
That's
does.
kind of like a
Thank you.
generic answer, but if there's like specific things where you're like, I just really have trouble with keeping my colors not muddy on the canvas, then we can talk about that, you know, very specifically. But like for a general, like, how do I focus my energies? I'd say have at least one avenue in which you're trying to really focus on getting some feedback on drawing if you feel like that needs to improve, especially if you want to do portraits. But, you know, in terms of paint, a lot of it's just experiencing paint in different ways, but in a controlled way. So like I'm intentionally trying to be opaque. This is color studies. I'm intentionally trying to be opaque. I'm trying to say this color in relationship to that color, and I'm trying to learn how to simplify. And then the self-portrait could be like, you can almost try anything and work transparently, but you're working from life and trying to figure out, you know, playing with the paint in a different way, but they have different intentions.
Right. Right. Awesome. Yes. Very, very helpful. Thank you.
Okay. Don't be afraid to reach out if you're in the middle of all that stuff.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay. All right, great. Is it Karya? Did I say that right?
Yes, it's Karya.
Hi.
Hello. I'm sorry. I have a couple questions. I hope I'm not stealing anyone's time. First and foremost, it's a personal question. I could not find a print shop of yours on your website, really anywhere. And it's not like I can afford an original just yet. So is there a way for us to get prints from you somehow?
Oh, a print of my work, not just like a print to work from. Okay. So
Yes.
I don't like outwardly offer prints, but if there's like a painting of mine that you were like, oh, I'm interested in having a print of that. I do have high res images of pretty much all my paintings. So if there's one specifically that you're interested in, don't be afraid to email me and ask for, because I basically just like, it's like on demand for certain paintings. If it's a commission, I won't do a print of a commission, but but if there's other ones that you're interested in, I'm happy to like look into what the pricing is of that, because I could do it at almost any size in a way. So so yeah, so I don't really advertise it, but I do kind of one-off prints through either Printique or through my printer here in Boston. And we can talk about size and pricing.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, of course.
The second question is, the things you have done on YouTube on Gumroad, I don't think you even know how helpful they have been and what they have spared me. And I wanted to ask if there are other creators out there that you believe to be educational quality that we could also go check out, because I have found you first, but I'm sure there are people out there you respect.
Well, absolutely. So you may have seen, I don't know if you're on my newsletter or not, but if you're not on my newsletter, I always try to send out tips on that as well. I'll eventually put the link in here, but I just started contributing to the blog Muddy Colors. Are you familiar with that?
Yes.
Okay, so Muddy Colors is a great resource because while it tends to be a little illustration heavy, there's a lot of great technical information. I mean, any of the other instructors at ARA are real, like Eric Johnson, who teaches our online program, is incredibly helpful. He's coming back full force with trying to get more content online for him. He has great educational videos. I mean, I'm mostly, I would say, like looking at online. I mean, Natalie Featherston's also a great one to follow because she is great with doing like little mini tutorials. She works in these fabulous, super fun trompe l'oeil pieces, and she breaks down what looks like a very complicated process into very simplified information. And her structure, the way she structures information, is very similar to the way that I do as well. Off the top of my head, I'll have to think about that because I don't have right off the top of my head. I mean, actually, Todd Casey has a couple of books out. I do like the way he structures information in his books. And I feel like he's a really down to earth instructor / painter. I think he has a Patreon as well. Howard Lyon has a Gumroad, but I think he's mostly doing like photo packs that if you wanted reference images to work from, he's great too. He also does a lot of instructional videos. I'll have to compile a list of other resources. That's actually a good idea
Thank you.
for that's a good idea for like to have a permanent information on my blog is going to that's kind of where I'm keeping permanent information. And so having maybe like recommended resources would be a good blog to put up.
Thank you very much.
Okay,
And
so
I guess my last question.
Yeah, if you subscribe to my newsletter, I'll make sure to like post that once it's up there.
Thank you.
Okay.
I guess my last question is about getting out of bubbles. Let me put it that way. I am the reason of this chaos. I'm calling from Berlin. I ended up migrating here for education, hoping to find the education I need here. Of course, as a teenager dealing with the migration, I did not realize how drastically split the art world was. In my 5 years of education, we only got postmodern and conceptual. We, in the 5 years, did not learn perspective, color theory, anything like that, which is why you have been a lifesaver. That was the first structure that I was introduced. And I have networks, I have circles, but it feels like all the horizons I can see are postmodern. I can't see anything traditional or naturalistic around me, and I don't even know where to start looking for it. Where is the traditional world?
That's well, I mean, I can tell you where it is on the online world. Where you physically are, I'd have a hard time being able to speak to that in a way. But
or in the world.
Yeah. So I mean, you're gonna find a lot in I would assume Italy. Italy would be a place, especially like Florence. So there's a couple of ateliers that are in Florence, and there's like obviously a lot of appreciation for that type of artwork there. But I would say that my recommendation is to find artists who are working in the methods that you're interested in, or just even the style that you're interested in, and build a community with them, or ask them those questions as well. So like I could, again, I could list off like 8,000 different Instagram accounts you should follow and reach out to artists. But, it does, especially like if you're geographically wanting to maybe even meet up with some of these people, that's where, I mean, social media can be unhealthy in so many ways, but it's also incredible for connecting with people, right? So don't be afraid to reach out to people and message people and say, hey, I really like your artwork, or do you have any shows anyplace? I'd love to, see some of it in person. So if you're kind of feeling like you're in a bubble that isn't rich in that space, you may be surprised to find that there is some, but you're just not like maybe running into those people. And so you have to put yourself either in front of more people or find them online and find where they are, and they might be able to connect you with other people as well. So it comes back to that building a community, and just don't be afraid to reach out to people, because most of us artists just sit in a dark room all day when we're painting, and we want to connect with people, but it's hard. So I would say don't be afraid to reach out to people and find, you may be able to like stumble on people who are geographically near you, who, appreciate or like the same things as well, or, can further you in that direction.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I wish I had a little bit more of a concrete answer for you, but.
Oh, it's all right. It at least gives me a point to start looking for people. And I also want to thank you again for the education resources you have put out there. There's very little on realistic academic level training, and it has truly been a light in the dark.
Oh,
Thank
great.
you
I'm
very
glad.
much.
I mean, obviously follow the school's YouTube as well, and our channel, because we're trying to do more like micro lessons, and having like the program online, but we also have the recorded webinars so people can kind of listen to information at their own pace. And as the assistant director of the school, obviously part of my goal and my passion is to make this information available to anybody, because it is, I feel like it belongs to everybody. And the problem is it's you know, been minimized a lot in the past 100 years. And so trying to find, you know, people who are passionate about it and willing to share that information is, we want to be one of those people. They're groups of people. So definitely follow all the instructors at the school. I actually do know, oh my gosh, that's so funny because Eric Johnson was just living in Germany. And he literally just left.
It's all right.
Darn it.
It's all
Oh,
right. Thank you very much.
Yes, of course. Donna, you just asked, is Howard Lyon, Lyon? Okay. All right. And then I see Susan.
Hi, Julie.
Hi, Susan.
Thank you for doing this. And I like the way you answer questions in a real simple format, easy for us to understand.
Yeah.
And really down to earth. So I love
thank
that. So my question is, you know, I like to do portraits with oil painting or charcoal or pencil, but I struggle with the background. Like
You and me both.
like, yeah, like it's like, oh, what background should I put? So it's not just like the face on a page.
Yes. Yeah.
If you have any tips about that, yeah.
I might not be the best person to ask for that because I have that same problem. And actually I have that same problem with still lifes too, where I'm like, okay, I have a great still life, but now like, what do I do in the background?
Right.
So, I mean, I use Photoshop for a lot.
Okay.
I mean, it depends on what your intention for the portrait is. So, you know, do you feel like you're coming at the portrait with kind of a narrative aspect or more of just a kind of a representation of the person? Like, where do you feel like you're coming at the portrait with? Like, what's your intention with it, I guess?
I feel like it's the representation of the person, like trying to capture something about their essence.
Okay.
And that's what I'm mostly focused on. And then later it's like, oh yeah, what about the background to make it actually like a good piece of artwork?
Yeah. Okay. Well, so designing a background for a portrait like that has like infinite possibilities. So I would suggest 2 to 3 things. Number 1 is collect images of paintings you feel like are successful like that.
Okay.
So just collect them and like just dump them all into a folder and don't look at the folder until you feel like you have like 40 to 50 images in there. And then what I want you to do is look at them all together.
Okay.
So what that will do is kind of show you the pattern that you are responding to. And I actually stumbled on this when Pinterest was first a thing.
Yeah.
I would just, you know, put that in there like that. I like that. And then when I saw them all together, I noticed a repeating situation, a single person in a scene with like an animal or a single person. There was like this repetition of, and I couldn't have verbalized that to you before that. So what I'm saying is that you might be responding to something over and over again. And that might be a good place to start to try that.
Okay.
Right. So first collect a bunch of images where you feel like it's a portrait. The background isn't necessarily this like elaborate narrative or, you know, context. It's more of a design and see what you're responding to. So that's number 1. But number 2, because you're thinking more of the representation of the person, and what I want you to do is also think about the abstract qualities to the portrait. And so what I mean by that is oftentimes you're going to see let's say there's like a light source where it's bright on the right hand side and dark in the hair is dark, whatever's on the left hand side. You're going to see that normally they're putting light behind the dark and dark behind the light.
Okay.
So it creates this kind of illusion that it makes the brighter side of the face seem brighter and push more forward because you're surrounding it by the shadow side and dark. And then what that also does is it sets the person off from the background because you're creating like a difference between the like my head right here is like light back here, but dark here, right? So you're kind of
Yes.
creating contrast to help take that person off of the surface. And I would also argue that that you should be thinking about the edge quality of the person. So
Yes.
make sure it doesn't look like a helmet. You don't want it to be like
Yeah.
this sharp edge along the hair. Against
Yeah,
that
that they
background.
have the edges have to go
Right,
blend
so-
into the background, so it's not
Exactly.
like a cartoon or something.
Yeah. You know, and sometimes it's just a little bit of that background. You know, maybe your hair, you paint it so the hair goes out a little bit further than you want. You take background color and you start to just kind of dry brush it over to create the transition. So, I mean, that's just a suggestion. You don't have to do that.
Mhm.
But, you know, using values and colors to accentuate or hide. So maybe you just want the focus to be on the bright side of the face. So maybe it's all dark. And so you start to completely lose the edge of where the hair meets a
Oh,
background.
see.
So
Yeah.
those are going to have two different qualities. If you do, you know, light and dark versus all dark or all light, you know, so it kind of, you have different ways to emphasize and create, like you're the director. And so sometimes it helped, like my first suggestion was a way for you to understand what you like as a director. And then
Okay.
also, how do you use abstract qualities like value and shape to either create it in the space or in front of the space or, you know, consumed by the space? Those are all the things you're going to be playing with.
Okay. That's really helpful. That's great. Thank you,
Okay.
Julie.
Yeah, of course. All right, we'll go with Pierre next.
Hi. Just a follow-up from earlier. You use a solvent at the beginning, maybe the first layer, but then you don't really use medium much at all, eh? I mean, the subsequent layers, basically you work medium pre.
Yeah, so my first, so I tone the canvas with usually just a thin layer with a little bit of solvent in it. So that's like super thin. There's a video on my YouTube on how to do that. My first color layer is usually just paint with a tiny bit of solvent if I have to. Okay. That's because I just hate how solvent basically makes oil paint turn into like watercolor. Like it's just so dramatic, even if you just use a little bit. So I'm just trying to use a little bit because I want it to be thin. I don't want to have physical buildup and I want it to dry quickly, but sometimes it actually dries too quickly for my opinion. So ideally I'd rather just kind of scrub regular paint down. It's going to be still a pretty fast drying layer because it's thin and it's more scrubby. And it does kind of allow me to keep the paint wet for a little bit longer so I can soften edges. In my second layer, which is usually where I'm building form or I'm the most opaque with the paint, I'm trying to use just paint. So I'm using pretty good quality paints. However, if you find that some of your paints are a little too stiff to be able to flow like out of your brush or to lay on the surface, then I might add a drop or two of oil to the tubed paint that's on my palette. So that would be the only medium I'm adding for the second layer. I do find that because I have a cleaning tank with linseed oil in it, so if I have a brush, I'm a lazy painter. So I recommend using more than one brush while you're painting, but that doesn't mean I do that when I'm painting. So I tend to use the same like 2 or 3 brushes during a painting session because if it's doing what I want it to do, I'm going to keep using it. So if I'm going from my darks to my lights and I want to keep using this brush, I go into my cleaning tank and I agitate it in the oil to pull the pigment out. And then what I have is an oily brush. And then I take paper towel and I really try to pull that oil out. Okay. But as I pick up additional paint, maybe a little bit of that oil gets into it, but you can see all I'm really ever adding to my paint is pretty much just linseed oil. So I'm not using medium in the second layer. I'm trying to make it fully opaque. Anytime you add any medium to your paint, it will increase transparency. Okay. So if I'm trying to do a fully opaque layer and I'm adding a bunch of medium to it, it's going to be slip slidey and I'm going to be getting variations in the thickness of the paint and the density, and that's going to change how it appears. So I prefer to have 0 additional medium into my second layer because I want a lot of control. And the easiest way to control the paint is to have it just be paint. Does that make sense?
Yeah, the simpler the better, I guess.
Mm-hmm. And then when I need a little bit of extra movement in that paint, that's my final layer if I'm finessing transitions. Now I'm talking about like if I was just paint skin or just like something fully opaque. My last layer may have some additional oil added just to increase the fluidity so that if I use like a makeup brush, if I have 2 pieces of paint next to each other and I want them to kind of blend together a little bit more, I may take, this color and run it into the other color. Or I might take an actual physical makeup brush and try to soften one into the other. And so that requires a little bit of extra movement. So my third layer, my final layer, I may have a little bit of extra oil that, if you're familiar with what's called a couch, or it's kind of like a thin glaze that I then put opaque paint into, that's the only extra medium I'm adding.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Very good.
Yeah. Yeah, I try not to use mediums if possible because sometimes when I'm doing special effects, I'll need a little extra oil because I just want it to be more see-through. So if I'm doing like old wood, I'm doing multiple layers of thinned paint, and that's going to be, I'm going to usually add like linseed oil to that.
Hi, this is Mark Jacobs.
Hi, Mark.
Hi. I have my question centers around color. When you do a face, do you outline the face for likeness or just color initially and then do likeness?
So usually for my process for a portrait is I'm usually doing a preliminary drawing. Okay. So, but that I have done it where I haven't, and I can show you an example of that. So normally with a portrait, I will do a preliminary drawing, and that allows for me to find physical locations and spaces and shapes and get the likeness in just a linear way. Right. So that's easy and controllable, and I get a better result faster. However, I have done it in the past where I went, so this painting right here, that painting was an experiment. And that painting, I wanted to do the whole painting in just a palette knife. So no preliminary drawing. And so what I did is I actually went directly onto the canvas with those masses. And I'm being really simple. The first layer is always really simple. We call it big form modeling at the Academy. And so I'm using generalizations of like my forehead was all one color. I had my eye socket was all one color, right? So the simplification was and so the likeness comes through addition of information. So likeness can actually be really accurate, even in a simplified way. Let me see if I can find, I'm going to show an example of that.
Okay, great.
I think I'm going to do a, hey, Julie, why'd you make that video for this portrait? There we go. I'm going to open all of these. Okay. So if you see this first pass here, is that the first pass? Yeah. I don't have any facial features.
Okay.
Okay. So, but this is still a likeness. Like this could still recognizably be me.
Right.
Right. So likeness is not actually in the details. I think this is a pretty common misconception with realism is that to get more real, you have to put more details in, and that is false.
Ah,
To
okay.
get more real, you actually have to understand what you need to leave out. It's very backwards, but
Yes.
but you can see how this is a very simplified application. It's using just a palette knife, and it still looks like me.
That
So
was
that,
palette
and then by
knife?
adding additional information, it gets more and more like me, but there's a point at which you max out.
Wait, did you say that you use a palette knife to at least get the shapes?
This is all palette knife.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
So that's what it ended up like. I didn't end up finishing it all on a
Wow.
palette knife. I realized that I
sure.
didn't need to do the whole thing in a palette knife. So I did this little side experiment where I was like,
Oh,
what's gonna look like if I do the whole thing in palette knife? And I'm like, okay, well, this is fine, but why do I need to do that? I was like setting restrictions for no good reason. So I did most of it with a palette knife, but then the face I kind of finished off a little bit more with brushes.
okay.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks. Thank
Of
you.
course.
Yeah.
Great.
Are you at the in Boston?
I am in Boston.
Yeah, me too.
Oh,
Well,
cool.
up in Bedford.
Oh,
So
wonderful. You should
yeah.
come by you should come by the school sometime.
Yeah, I will.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Yep. Let's see. Sanchita. Did I say that right?
Yes, you're right. I may forget the question, so I thought I'll write it down. So you can read the questions that I've already.
You want me to read the question out loud?
Yes,
Let's see. Okay,
please.
weird. Talk about grounds, oil ground or acrylic gesso ground. How many layers of ground if you're making your own? How long to wait between layers and how long after done to start painting on it? Which brand do you recommend? Okay. I am a very lazy painter, as I have said. So I don't like to make my own grounds. I like to buy things and then use them. The difference that you're going to have between the ground types. Now, I've bought a lot of types of grounds and I've used them. And if you go onto my blog, I actually have a comparison where I did some tests, and you can actually, I actually did videos where you can see all the tests, because I was trying to find a new panel a year or so ago, a couple years ago. So oil grounds and acrylic gesso grounds, the difference is really going to be how the paint acts on top of it. Okay. The oil ground is going to be slightly less absorbent. Acrylic grounds tend to suck in the paint a little bit more, so it's a little bit harder to kind of scrub the paint around. Whereas oil grounds, the paint's going to maybe flow a little bit longer. Does that make sense? So a lot of times people love lead ground. So lead grounds.
I was wondering if you guys have any ski boots in stock.
What? Okay. Everybody's muted. Okay. The lead ground. So a lot of times people use a lead ground for their surface, and lead grounds are super not absorbent. And you may have also tried out, they're called gesso boards. Gesso boards are actually, to me, like almost like an ice skating rink. Like my paint does not want to sit on the surface. So I don't know what they do to that surface, but my paint does not want to grab. It just kind of, the more I try to push the paint around, the more it kind of pulls off. Okay. So the way I learned, the surface that I learned on, I tend to stay with because I know how the paint's going to act on it. So I like an oil ground because it's not as absorbent as an acrylic ground, but it's not as slippery as a lead ground or like the gesso board from Ampersand. Okay. So your painting style, or what you're trying to get out of, I think mostly it's the first layer that you care most about in terms of how the paint acts. In the long run, grounds are kind of also at the mercy of what the ground is on. Okay. So I recommend panels because panels are more archival. They're easier to ship. They're easier to cut down. They're just easier in the long run. And full disclosure, I'm also an ambassador for Artifacts. But that's only because I believe in what they make. I've used it. I can get behind it, and I'm totally on board with it. It's, to me, a wonderful, they have a lot of different surfaces. I like their 538s. That's oil ground on linen that's glued down to the ACM. I love ACM because ACM is so easy to modify the shape of. So I can buy like an 18 by 24 and I decide I need a 7 by 18, I can cut that down in a matter of seconds. It's super easy.
Yeah, that's the one I got, like the ACM panels, just plain raw.
Yeah.
So I was about to gesso, so I thought I would ask you.
Yeah, I mean, I would actually recommend, I think you should try, I think you should use that ACM and try 3 different types of grounds. And try a little study on it and see which one acts more the way that works for you and your painting style. So it's the first layer is the one that's going to be the most dramatically different. But the second layer and third layer, you may find that some sink in more than others. I just deal with sinking in anyways. But the it's really going to be about how the paint acts on it. And to me, I hate stretched canvas because it bounces and it gets loose and whatever. And you're going to have more likely to like have cracking and issues with it. So the panels I think are the way to go. I really love them. And I love the Artifacts ones are nice too, because if you do get one of their surfaces that have the linen that or the canvas that's glued down, let's say the painting gets dropped and the corner gets kind of funky, the glue is actually heat activated. So you can actually take that canvas off and glue it down to a different piece of ACM.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So I think that's just fantastic. And I just feel like it's really universally easy to use. And it's the canvas I know and love. So that was a no-brainer for me to just be basically using Artifacts as 538.
And will this recording be there so we can watch later?
For this?
Yes.
Yeah. Yep. So once we wrap up, Zoom will export and everything, and then we'll have it up on the YouTube.
Okay.
The ARA YouTube.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Okay, so did anybody have any additional questions? I know Lucy, you still had the visual critique you were interested, but I'm also open to if there's any off the cuff questions. Karya?
This is a little bit I guess a little bit off topic, but the ARAs has scholarships and papering competitions that we can apply for the scholarships. I wanted to ask if a master copy is acceptable for submission or if it has to be an original.
So you're saying for this the scholarship competition that's open?
Yes, for that.
Yeah, that so master copies are absolutely valid. So when you're submitting images for that, anything and everything is viable. We're just looking to see like what your experience is, what your hand looks like, that type of thing.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, of course. I'm also going to put, somebody was asking about my newsletter. So if you want to subscribe to my personal newsletter, I think that'll lead you there. Okay, so we have Donna.
Yeah, this is when you were talking about the gesso, I think that has to do with the question I sent in yesterday, where everything's just globbed up on the portrait that I'm doing.
Yes, I forgot about that.
So, and if you could go into the, I might have another question after you look at what I wrote.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to read out what your question was.
Thank you.
So you're getting into painting a portrait, and right now you're using round brushes and feathering in both colors at transition areas to blend them together. You're having a hard time getting rid of the paint strokes, correct? And transitioning where it doesn't look blotchy. Is that the concern?
That is the concern, but even in normal straight color, you know, like a cheek that's not changing color, I still see the strokes. I can't get it. And I paint really thin. So
that's part of the problem.
Oh, but I've never had that problem before. So I'm beginning to think, after you talked about the gesso, I think that's why, because
Well, it's
the
you.
gesso,
So
I don't
the
remember what it was that I put it on the Centurion canvas. I
Yeah.
put 3 layers, sand, you know, and all that stuff, and way dry.
Yeah.
Because I did it last year. So I'm still, should I just scrape it all off?
Well, so it
it's now
depends. So
building up
are you saying that there's you're seeing physical like ridges almost in the
Yeah, I can't get a total smooth. I don't see the ridges, but now that I've built up so many layers, I'm seeing ridges. So I'm
And do
about
you think
ready to
that was
scrape
that there from the gesso when you first started?
No, the gesso's pretty smooth, and I wouldn't mind that showing through.
Okay.
But it's
Okay.
just the buildup of all the layers, because I'm trying, you know, I was
Mhm.
trying to. Then I made the mistake of putting some walnut in there, you know. Now I'm a total mess.
Yeah. Okay. So I think there's a couple things that could be happening. So if you're talking about seeing brush strokes as an unevenness of colors and values, I was going to say that the issue is that you could be painting too thin. Because again, you're dealing with this on top of this on top of this, and you're trying to make it look, you know, smooth. So if it's that there's visual variation due to colors and values that don't look the way they should, that's one thing. But if you're talking about physical buildup of the actual paint layer over layer, it could be that you, usually at the end of every painting session, I do use a makeup brush to knock down any physical texture. So I would recommend that after you're done for a day of painting, making sure that you look at it from below, so you can actually, or look at it in raking light it'll kind of illuminate more where there's texture where maybe you don't want it to be. Okay. And if you're, so if you're painting thin, that's a good thing, because you're going to have less likely. That's why I like doing the layers like I do, because my fully opaque layer doesn't need gunky globs of paint to be opaque, because I have a layer underneath it that's supporting it. So I prefer to do 3 thinner layers, or 2 or 3 thinner layers, than 1 or 2 globby thick layers, right? Because that's where you're really going to get those ridges, is thick layers. So it's not that you're painting, it's not because you're painting too thin. It could be that, like, even if you're putting it on thin and there's like a little bit of variation in that physical texture, if you leave it and it dries, you're screwed. Some people like to sand down their paintings. I use lead white, so I never sand my paintings. I just make sure that at the end of a painting session, I take a makeup brush, which is very soft, very low resistance, and I'm going to just really lightly knock down any of those textures so that it prepares me for the next layer. Okay. Does that answer your question? Was that the end of the question? Okay, great. Okay. And then Terry.
Hi, Julie. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Thanks. I just wanted to ask a question about your sketching practice. I'm several years into some training and I've done some bargs, and I'm noticing that after you spend several hundred hours doing battle with the black dots and very refined shading, it's affected how my sketch practice works. And I'm just noticing if that's a transition or an issue that you've seen in your practice or in your experience as a teacher, that sudden difficulty with doing quick sketches now. I'm just finding that any sort of tone I try to apply in my sketchbook, I end up turning it into a mini drawing that takes dozens and dozens of hours, which kind of defeats the purpose of that mileage of building up and repetition. So that's kind of the tension I'm experiencing right now. I wondered if you had any wisdom or words about that. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So my advice would be to don't worry about it. No. Okay. I am completely guilty of being a horrible sketcher. Like I don't sketch enough. I don't have a sketchbook. It's like usually just ends up as grocery lists. So, but what I would say is that part of that I think is a reaction to, you know, how good you can get. You know how good a drawing can be. And so that's why it's harder to just say like, this is just a thing. Like, you know, this is just a thing for right now. So one thing that might actually be really helpful is I did this shortly after I started the Barg drawing class, which was there's a couple of the like helpful resource books. Like there's like the Book of 1,000 Hands, or like I think Loomis has some of them, or 100 Hands, where it was just like, you know, his sketches of hands that he did, and there's like 100 of them or something. And then I was gonna say, I'm gonna just do a sketch a day, and you only give yourself a time limit. And that's it, you're done. Right. So it kind of like frees you up of like, this is not up, or go someplace that you can only be in for a limited time. Go to the museum and draw one of the statues there. So what you have to do is kind of give yourself opportunities to experience the freedom of not caring, because you're deep diving and caring in one instance. You have to give yourself the balance of the ability to have a freedom of making mistakes, of making things that don't look good. That freedom is incredibly important. And I do actually think that comes back to what Natalie was asking about, like, how do you like leave training and then know what to do? You're comfortable and you kind of know what's possible, but if you don't give yourself the opportunity to fail repeatedly, or to fail and try something different or do something uncomfortable, you're not going to evolve or grow. So I think having, I was going to do a sketch a day for a year. I think I got like 40 days in and then stopped, as we usually do with New Year's resolutions. But that was really helpful to me, because it wasn't about having a finished drawing. It wasn't about, I never show my sketchbook to anybody because it's really not impressive at all. It's more a way for you to just kind of like turn your brain off and just let your eye and hand work together. And a lot of times when you're doing bark drawing or more articulated, more elaborate technical information, you're so present. And that can also be great too, because it acts like a meditation in a way. Like you're trying to be very purposeful, and everything's done with a reason, and there's logic behind it. But then we also want to also have that counteractive side, which is not counteractive, counterbalance side, which is the bravery of doing something and just seeing what happens, right? We need both of those things to kind of work in concert. So in a way, think of it as practicing that part of your art practice, which is practicing the taking a risk, the practicing of not caring. Most people do a lot of their best work on materials that are like, they were like, I just started this and I didn't care because I did it on cardboard and now I like it. And it's because you didn't care. You weren't precious about it. So I do think it's important to build that skill of turning on the caring and turning off the caring, because you'll get different things out of those two things. Does that make sense?
No, that was a phenomenal answer. Thank you. I'm going to write the bravery of doing something and seeing what happens next to my easel on a Post-it. Thank you so much.
That is something I struggle with I'm literally in the middle of struggling with that myself in my own studio. So there's, it just gets more complicated, but you know, I think the technical training gave me knowledge and power, but that knowledge and power can also be very seducing for those of us who are control freaks. So we need to also put just as much energy into practicing the things that are going to make us create amazing stuff.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. Thomas.
Yeah, hi, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
First of all, let me just thank you for doing this. This has been great. I think I speak for everybody here. It's been great. I can't wait for the next one. I can't wait till it's your turn to come around again. But they're
fun.
They're all good. I just want a little clarification on the highlights. You were talking about the catch light, where the paint physically catches the light, and then you also talked about using stand oil, which levels the paint, and I wondered if those two weren't at odds with each other, because I'm just missing something there.
I see what you're saying. So the physical highlight will, even with, so I'm adding just a tiny bit of stand oil to the lead white. And lead white by itself, when you kind of put it down, it kind of wants to create like a little like tip at the, like this is like a large, this is a zoomed up dollop of paint. The lead white that I use, it's Natural Pigments lead white #1 made with linseed oil. So when I'm creating that mound of the paint, a lot of times when I'm like pulling the brush off, whether it's with a round or whether it's with the corner of a bright, it kind of creates a sharp tip on that mound, right? So what I'm trying to do with the stand oil, when I do that with the stand oil, instead of that tip kind of slowly levels out to more of a rounded surface. So it's not going to level totally flat. It's just going to like level to, it's like the like a water droplet rather than paste, I guess. Does that make sense?
And you're not talking about a lot of stand oil either, just a drop.
No.
Okay.
Just enough to like, just a couple of drops of stand oil in a pile of lead white will kind of, you'll start to see it. It's almost like fluff. If you like look at fluff in a container after like it being in the cupboard for like a day, it's flat. That's kind of what it's kind of just leveling itself out rather than it being kind of sharp, like when you first take fluff out of the container. I do a lot of food analogies. Does that make sense, Thomas?
Yeah, that's great. That's great. I liked your answer to Natalie's question. You had talked, I'd heard you once before about the red and the blue next to the light, but I really liked your close-ups and going a little deeper into that. I think
Thanks.
it's fascinating.
Yeah. I mean, and this is why it's important to see work in person, is because I just recently listened to a really fabulous lecture that's through Studio Incominati with Margaret Boatland, who's like my new obsession right now. But the way she talks about using the paint and being able to see how a painting is constructed, and that's why it's so important to go physically see work, because there's so much information right in front of your eyes when you go to a museum or you see other people's work in person. It's so, when you have some experience oil painting, it's so obvious how the painting was constructed when you see it. This is the beauty of oil paint, is the ability to use layers and use like these like effects of like different colors on top of other colors and the different ways to use values. It's all, everything's right there in front of you. And it's a lot different than seeing it smashed onto your phone or even laptop screen. And a picture is just a picture of a painting is just a smashed flat image with pixels.
Well, thank you. It's
Yeah.
been great.
Great. Terry.
Sorry, that was my bad. I didn't lower my hand.
Oh, you didn't have a question?
Nope.
Okay, cool. Okay, so we have, and Thomas, I'm assuming your question is done. Unless there's any other questions, I can go to Lucy's visual critique, because we have like about 5 minutes left. If you have a question before I'm done with Lucy, you can raise your hand again, but I will do a little bit of a thank you before I get into that. But I do want to thank you for joining me here. These seem to be going for about 2 hours, which I think is a good time. And I do appreciate the fact that some people sent in some questions ahead of time. And this is also helpful for me too, because it also allows for me to kind of see where people are, especially, we interact online, but this is a way for us to interact in a little bit more of a personal way. And I don't remember I think Garrett Vitanza is going to be our next one. Garrett is a phenomenal teacher and a phenomenal artist. And so please make sure you join for his as well, because he is just a wealth of art history knowledge. The art history lectures, we've been offering them for free on our YouTube page, the ARA YouTube page. And definitely go watch those, because I'm learning a lot just by making him do them. but he's super interesting to talk to about art history. So definitely tune in for his. And then I will be on again for other ones. I may pop into those as well. But I will pull up, let's see, I might need to go back and get it from the Zoom. Okay, so this is a color study it has like almost like a landscape vibe.
So when I have been painting plein air, the colors have been crazy and very muddy looking to me. And to control that, I've been trying to study some pictures I like and just do color studies with a limited palette just to avoid having the mud happen.
Yes.
And I think I'm getting there. Like I'm happy with the value relationships in a lot of the areas like the shadows and the lights, but I'm still getting a little lost in the green area and I'm not sure how to improve because there are things I like about the left color study, things I like about the right, and I'm not sure which direction to go in.
Okay. So in what the left one you say is yellow ochre and cad red. So you just changed the red and yellow for each of these. Is that the difference in the two?
Yes, I felt like cad red and yellow ochre were both giving me slightly muddy results, and I couldn't go light and chromatic enough with the green or dark and chromatic enough. But then when I switched to cad yellow, I think it's too intense, and now I don't know what to do with myself.
Okay, so that makes total sense. So I'm assuming you're using ultramarine blue as your blue?
Yes.
Okay. So that makes total sense because the image on the left-hand side, you're using a mid-value, mid-chroma yellow, a high chroma mid-value red, and you're using a low value, high chroma blue. So when you're mixing those yellows in there and you're trying to get bright greens, your yellow is maxing out at a mid chroma. So when you say muddy, what you really mean is low chroma. Okay.
Yeah.
So with your your mid chroma yellow, you're only going to be able to get mid chroma or lower greens, right? So that is kind of what you're responding to in the left-hand side is that you feel like you're not able to get those like neon greens out of it because your yellow ochre kind of maxes out. And I would actually say your yellow ochre is more of yellow ochre tends to be more of a warmer yellow than, let's say, cad yellow. So again, you're trying to get lighter and brighter in those greens and you just can't hit it. That's called maxing out at your color gamut. You're just not capable with those three paints. You're not capable of doing that. Okay. So in your right-hand side where you do the cad yellow, you are getting a lot of those higher chroma greens. And that's because your yellow is a high chroma yellow and it's very light in value, right? Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So, so in terms of the values in the shadows, the reason you're able to so you have a much more dramatic value range on the right-hand side because of your alizarin. So in that same way, cad red is mid-value, high chroma. So if you're trying to add reds to any of your dark blues, it's going to lift the values up. Does that make sense? So you're not going to be able to get like dark purples because your cad red is pulling up your values in your shadows if you're adding red to them.
That makes sense.
Okay. So my suggestion would be to like, you could use, reserve alizarin for your shadows values for the reds and use cad reds in the lights and, or, cause you're mostly working more yellows and blues in this. And in terms of your yellows, your cad yellow is going to give you more capabilities. You absolutely can drop chroma. It's easier to drop chroma than it is to try to invent it or bring it back. So I would recommend using the ultramarine blue, the cad yellow, and then give yourself the 2 different reds, because you do still want some lower chroma capabilities in the lights, like in some of these trees. So you may want a little bit lower chroma, not neon green in here. That's where your CAD red's going to come in handy, because it's mid-value high chroma. But so you're going to be able to get both your low chroma and high chroma in the greens. I don't think you need yellow ochre then.
Okay, thank you. I was
Yeah?
thinking about going back, but I really wanted to keep the limited palette. Like,
I think
it's
there's
just
both,
so much
there's qualities
easier.
to both. So your limited palette's basically going to be CAD yellow, alizarin crimson, ultramarine blue, and CAD red. So you're just saying, I'm just going to give myself an extra red so that I have the ability to stay dark in my shadows, but not have them cold, cold, cold. And I also have the ability to drop chroma in my lights, because now I have a way to control the chroma in my greens.
Okay, that makes total sense. Thank you. And I did use that turquoise color you used because it is so pretty.
It's it's a little too tempting to use in everything.
Yes, every painting I'm like, can I use it? Can I use it? Is it time?
Yeah. If you
Okay,
see
thanks
any
so
of my
much.
paintings in person, you've probably seen like pure turquoise in there someplace.
It's just so pretty.
It is. Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. This was a lovely way to spend my Sunday morning. If you have any questions between now or actually after this, whenever, you guys all mostly know that I am available. I'm around. I answer questions. I hope to have you guys come see me in person and take one of my workshops at the Academy of Realist Art Boston, or take my webinar and reach out and let me know how you're doing. So, thank you so much for joining us. And this will be recorded and it'll go up on our YouTube. And I hope you all enjoy the rest of your Sunday.
Thank you.
Thank you, Julie.
Thank you. Bye,
Thank you.
everybody.
Awesome.
Thank you, Julie.
Awesome. Thanks, Julie.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Julie.
Bye.
This was really great.
Bye. I love you
Thank
all.
you very much.
Thank you.
Julie.